All right, so we are in the week of November 9th through the 12th. So this week you have Mastering EMP quiz over chapter 14 and an exam over chapters 12 through 14. So chapter 15 that we're covering this week is not on it, okay? So I just want to make sure you know which chapters to study for. It's neural tissue, spinal cord and spinal nerves, brain and cranial nerves. Okay, those are the chapters you need to study for the exam. All right, so we'll pick up where we left off in chapter 15. I believe we left off in the last video on general senses. So in your general senses, remember these are different from your special senses. So you have exteroreceptors, proprioreceptors, and interoreceptors. So these are different receptors you have to sense things. All right, these are more general in that you'll find these throughout your body. The exteroreceptors are going to provide information about your external environment, the extero. Proprioreceptors give you information about positions of your skeletal muscles and your joints. Your interoreceptors are going to monitor the visceral organs and functions. So things that are like your, small intestine, large intestine, things like that. All right. So you can divide up these senses in more detail into nociceptors, thermoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, and chemoreceptors. So the nociceptors are pain receptors. So they're going to be able to respond to a variety of stimuli, generally the ones that are associated with tissue damage. So you have free nerve endings, and they have large receptive fields. So they can be receptive to areas of things that are going around them for a good distance. You have 3 different groups of nociceptors. Some are sensitive to changes at extremes of temperature. Some are sensitive to mechanical damage, and some are sensitive to dissolved chemicals, okay? But each of those 3 things could cause pain, right? Pain receptors. And remember, we're still talking about receptors that connect to nerves. So when these dendrites get stimulated, you get a depolarization, okay, from the receptor. You have 2 types of painful sensations. They can be fast pain or slow pain. Fast pain is also known as prickling pain. So here, the sensations are going to be sent quickly to your central nervous system. Hence fast pain. Slow pain, it's more burning or aching. These are generalized activation of your thalamus as well as your reticular formation. These are parts of your brainstem, right? So the pain receptors their response is said to be more tonic, okay, when they're stimulated. So important point here, when you understand how the pain sensations originate, as well as understanding how your body's able to control or reduce pain levels, has a lot to do with how you treat pain, right? There's a whole kind of field of medicine called pain medicine, right? And treating people who have pain, okay? All right, so we covered the nociceptors. Let's talk about the temperature receptors or thermoreceptors. So obviously, as the name suggests, they're responding to changes in the temperature. And there are these thermoreceptors. You have free nerve endings. And relative to warm receptors, you have 3 times as many cold receptors. Okay. So temperature sensations are going to be carried on the same pathway where you find your pain sensation. Okay, and they're going to be sent to, again, the reticular formation in the thalamus, but also they're going to be sent to the primary sensory cortex. The mechanoreceptors will respond to physical distortion, pressure, and contact. So membranes have mechanically gated ion channels. Remember those? All right, so you have 3 different kinds of mechanoreceptors. So they can be tactile receptors, they can be baroreceptors, or proprioceptors. Start with the tactile receptors. So they're responding, as the name suggests, they're tactile, so they're responding to things like touch, pressure, and vibration. Okay, and they're classified by how fine the touch is that they're detecting. All right, so you can have fine touch and pressure receptors or crude touch and pressure receptors. All right, so as the name suggests, fine touch and pressure receptors are going to give you very detailed information about where they're being stimulated. The crude touch and pressure receptors don't provide very good localization. It's more of a generalized touch and pressure sense. All right, so we also have just generally, we classify tactile receptors in other ways as well. So we have the free nerve endings, which are sensitive to pressure and touch. We have root hair plexuses. Okay, I think we talked about those briefly when we talked about the integumentary system. And they're going to monitor distortions or changes in movements across the surface of your body. The Merkel's discs, these are fine touch and pressure receptors. Okay. Meissner's corpuscles, you may remember those. Those are also fine touch and pressure receptors. They can also detect low frequency vibrations. Pacinian corpuscles, you may remember those. They're sensitive to deep pressure, right? So P and Pacinian for pressure, right? And the Ruffini corpuscles are sensitive to pressure and distortion in your skin. Okay. Remember, distortion, you're saying like if I'm moving it out of normal position, right? So that's the tactile receptors. Next, we have the baroreceptors. And baro has to do with pressure. You may have heard of barometric pressure. So baroreceptors monitor changes in blood vessel or blood pressure in the walls of your arteries and veins. You have free nerve endings that are branching within the tissues in a specific area. The baroreceptors that you'll find in the digestive tract help you with coordinating reflexes related to digestion. Okay, because some things in your digestion are very involuntary, they're just reflexes. Actually, a lot of it is. Other baroreceptors are going to monitor pressure changes in your reproductive tract and your urinary tract. Okay. So you're going to respond immediately and adapt rapidly. Okay, so something specific about baroreceptors there. So let's move on to the proprioceptors. All right, so here we're monitoring position in your joints, monitoring tension in your tension in your tendons, as well as your ligaments, and the state of which your muscles are contracted. All right, so proprioceptors have your muscles, tendons, joints, ligaments, okay? They include the muscle spindles and tendon organs. They're not adaptive to constant stimulation, and they're continuously sending information because your muscles are always sort of in a state of at least some contraction or relaxation. All right. So being tickled or feeling a sense of itching or itchiness related to sensations of pain and touch. And you'll have free nerve endings there. Okay. So we'll take a pause here and basically talk about our general senses and our nociceptors, our thermoreceptors, and our mechanoreceptors. Okay. So we'll pick up with chemoreceptors next. And you can do this at home as well. All right, so now that we talked about the thermoreceptors, nociceptors, and mechanoreceptors, let's talk about the chemoreceptors. So as the name suggests, they are responsive to small changes in concentration of specific chemicals. So generally, they are responding to things that are substances that are water soluble and lipid soluble, that are dissolved in your surrounding fluid. Okay. And so when those receptors are stimulated, information is going to be sent to centers in your brainstem that deal with autonomic control, things like respiratory function, cardiovascular function. So things that are automatic and voluntary. And these receptors are going to monitor chemical composition of your body fluids, like your blood and your cerebral spinal fluid. Okay. So, and it should, even if you don't know all the details there, I mean, you should know generally, your respiratory system and your cardiovascular system are typically functioning involuntarily. And so if you have got maybe high concentrations of O2 or CO2, you have receptors that can tell that and adjust your breathing, and adjust your cardiovascular function in order to get you back to homeostasis. Okay. All right. So, and because they're dealing with things that are more autonomic, the communication with the brain is continuous, as well as with the spinal cord and other peripheral nerves. So pathways. So pathways in this context mean the nuclei, which are kind of like your neuron cell bodies or clusters of neuron cell bodies, and tracts that are connecting the brain with other parts of the body. So you have sensory pathways and motor pathways, and they'll have a series of synapses. Remember, those are those spaces or connections between one neuron and some other tissue. And those synapses will connect with one another. At each step, you get opportunities for facilitation or inhibition. You have opportunities for divergence, and we'll talk more about what that is, and activation of other neuronal pools or pools of neurons. All right, so many forms of interaction, regulation, and feedback are going to connect higher centers or centers that deal with higher functions and with other parts of your brainstem. Okay. So now that we've kind of introduced the sensory and motor pathways, let's get more into that. So your ascending tract, ascending means what? Up or down, going up, right? So that's typically sensory, right? You're sending sensory, you've sent something in your body and sending it up to your central nervous system. Descending means going down. So typically that's going to be a motor tract, sending signals to your muscles or to other organs, other effectors. All right, and the tract names will indicate origins and destinations of the various axons that are involved. Okay, let's start with the sensory pathways. The sensory receptor, that's component of those pathways. You have some specialized cells, could be also dendritic processes or dendrites, or processes on the dendrites that are monitoring your body's conditions could be monitoring the external environment. And there's going to be an interface between your nervous system and your internal or external environment, right? So a sensation, what's that? Well, a sensation is going to arrive in the form of some action potential. Okay, so it's basically the effect of the stimulation in an afferent fiber. Remember, afferent has to do with ascending or sensory. All right, so your general senses. We mentioned this before, but things like temperature, touch, pain, proprioception, which has to do with body or muscle position, and pressure and vibration, right? And those are things that are not specific to one area of your body, right? So these are things that you can sense across your body or throughout your body. So these are general senses. Okay, perception is conscious awareness of some situation. Okay. So you're consciously aware of something, you're perceiving it, okay? And only about 1% of that information that gets provided by the afferent fibers is going to reach the cerebral cortex and our conscious awareness, okay? So the receptors for the general senses, it's the nociceptors. They're going to respond to different stimuli that are usually associated with tissue damage. All right, and they're going to cause sensation and pain. All right, so we talked about that. Nociceptors deal with pain. Thermoreceptors deal with temperature. Mechanoreceptors deal with physical distortion, contact or pressure. Chemoreceptors deal with chemicals. We talked about that already, with just linking it to the concept of sensory pathways. So how are the sensory pathways organized? Well, you have different neurons involved. So you've got first order neurons, second order neurons, and third order neurons. So the first order neurons are the sensory neuron that's delivering a sensation to the central nervous system, okay? And it's going to be located in your dorsal root ganglion, all right? Remember, dorsals has to do with the sensory or afferent or ascending tracts. Second order neuron is an inner neuron, okay? So it's in between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. And it synapses with the first order neuron. It's located somewhere in the spinal cord or in your brainstem. This axon crosses over to the opposite side of the body. Okay. Third order neuron is going to synapse with your second order neuron. It's located in the thalamus. Okay. And your right cerebral hemisphere is going to receive sensory information from your left side of your brain. Your left cerebral hemisphere is going to receive sensory information from the right side of the brain. Okay. All right, you have three major somatic sensory pathways, also known as somatosensory pathways. Remember, a lot of this has to do with somatic, has to do with skeletal muscle. You have your posterior column, your spinothalamic and Spinocerebellar Pathway, so those are your three ones. So start with the first one, posterior column pathway. The posterior column pathway is going to carry things like fine touch, pressure, and proprioceptive sensations. All right. So the axons are going to go up within what we call the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. We discussed those in the previous chapter, and they relay information up to your thalamus through the medial lemniscus. All right, so I know we're covering a lot of new terms, so just bear with me. So before those axons actually enter the medial lemniscus, they're going to decussates or cross over, and that means go over to the opposite side of your brainstem. And the axons from that medial lemniscus are going to synapse in your ventral posterolateral or ventral posteromedial nucleus. And remember, nucleus in this context is like a neuron cell body. So these nuclei are going to sort sensations or organize the sensations according to the nature of that stimulus and what part of your body is involved. Okay. So your ability to determine where on your body your stimulus has come from, it's going to depend on the projection of that information from these areas we just talked about, the ventral posterolateral nucleus, up to the primary sensory cortex. Okay. We also have the sensory homunculus, and it provides essentially a map of your primary sensory cortex. And this was actually, it's created by researchers that basically stimulated your person's primary sensory cortex. And the individuals told the researchers where the stimulus originated. Okay, so it's more of a map of what's going on inside the brain and where stimulation's coming from. Okay, so with the Spinothalamic pathway, let's see, yeah. The Spinothalamic pathway is carrying poorly localized sensations of touch, of pressure, pain, and temperature. So axons that are involved are going to desiccate or cross over in your spinal cord. And they're going to go up or ascend within the anterior, front, and lateral side spinothalamic tracts up to your ventral posterolateral and ventral posteromedial nuclei in your thalamus. The projection of your sensation to these different second and third order neurons, remember we just talked about those, determines whether an arriving stimulus is going to be considered painful, whether it's considered cold, whether it's considered hot, whether it's considered vibrating. So our ability to determine where on your body your stimulus originated from is going to depend on how the appropriate area of the primary sensory cortex gets stimulated. Okay. So related to that, medical term, usually in their underline, makes good matching. So phantom limb pain, when a person experiences pain in an amputated limb, and the limb's no longer there, but they're still feeling pain in that limb. So it's caused by activity in the sensory neurons or the interneurons that once monitored conditions in that limb. Also, another term is referred pain. It's like when a person feels pain in an area that's uninjured, when the pain's actually originating somewhere else. So, example, you have the pain of a heart attack and the pain of appendicitis. Okay, so a person might be having a heart attack but feel pain in their arm or something like that. Okay, or having a pain in appendicitis but actually feeling it somewhere else. Last pathway is the Spinocerebellar Pathway. So including the posterior and anterior spinocerebellar tracts. So again, spinos for spinal cord, cerebellar for the cerebellum. And it's carrying sensations to your cerebellum, right? From or that are concerning positions of things like your joints, tendons, and your muscles. Information doesn't reach your conscious awareness. Okay, so this is something that your body's dealing with unconsciously, right? You're not thinking to do it. All right, so let's pause there, show you a few pictures. All right. So shows you some examples here of tactile receptors. These are free nerve endings. Okay, so they're just kind of free out there inside the level of the skin. There's a tactile corpuscle. There's a root hair plexus. You got free nerve endings around the hair. There's some tactile discs. Okay, it's got kind of a disc shape toward the distal end. And you connect that to a Merkel cell. All right, bulbous corpuscle or Ruffini corpuscle. Here's a lamellar corpuscle. All right, so one's on baroreceptors. So you have them in the carotid sinus and aortic sinus, in the lung, digestive tract, stomach, small intestine, baroreceptors in your colon or large intestine, and in the bladder wall, okay, dealing with changes in pressure. Okay, you've got some chemoreceptors. So you have some near the medulla oblongata, carotid bodies in near your carotid arteries in your throat, near your aorta. You have chemoreceptors there as well. Okay. And we'll kind of stop here with the pathways. So you've got your posterior column pathway. Why do we call it that? Because this is the posterior part of your spinal cord. Okay, you get your gracile fasciculus and your cuneate fasciculus, spinothalamic pathway. You have your anterior, because it's the anterior spinothalamic tract, and your lateral spinothalamic tract. Now in yellow here, we've got your spinocerebellar pathway. This is anterior spinocerebellar tract, posterior spinocerebellar tract. Okay. All right, showing you more here about how the spinothalamic pathway sends signals up from the spinal cord to the medulla oblongata, okay, to the midbrain, into the brain, to the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, posterior column pathway here, spinal cord, right, medulla oblongata, midbrain, primary somatosensory cortex, but again, it's in the posterior region, originating there. Spinocerebellar pathway, okay, more on the sides, going up to the medulla oblongata, to the pons, to the cerebellum. Okay, it doesn't go into the cerebrum, goes to the cerebellum. All right. So let's take a break there and talk about those different sensory pathways that we just discussed. Okay. You can do this at home as well. All right, so now that we've covered sensory pathways, let's cover motor pathways. So big picture here, we'll talk about the somatic nervous system or somatic motor system and the autonomic nervous system or visceral motor system. Okay, so the somatic nervous system is controlling contractions of your skeletal muscles. Remember we talked about connection between somatic and skeletal muscles, and it's under voluntary control. Autonomic nervous system is involuntary typically and controls your visceral effectors like smooth muscle and cardiac muscle and glands. Okay. So the somatic motor pathways are going to always involve an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. Okay, so there's not very many things where you can see always. So usually if it's something that's always, it's pretty important. It's always going to have upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. And the upper motor neurons, some of that neurons going to be in the central nervous system processing center, or processing center located in the central nervous system. And the lower motor neuron, the soma, is going to be located in the brain stem or the spinal cord in a motor nucleus. the upper motor neuron is synapsing on the lower motor neuron. And that should make sense because motor pathways are what, ascending or descending? They're descending because they're going down to the body. So the upper is going to synapse on the lower motor neuron. And the upper motor neuron can either facilitate that lower motor neuron or inhibit it. Okay. Related to motor pathways, talk about the pyramidal system. In the pyramidal system, it's going to provide voluntary skeletal muscle control, right? Skeletal muscle is voluntary. It's direct in that there are no synapses between your pyramidal cells and your lower motor neurons, okay? So you're just getting a synapse directly to the pyramidal cells. And these pyramidal cells are neurons in your primary motor cortex. Okay. You can also describe motor neurons or motor pathways rather in terms of different types of descending tracts. You have corticobulbar, lateral corticospinal, and anterior corticospinal tracts. So we had a set of 3 for the sensory. Now we have a set of 3 for the motor pathways. So if we start with the corticobulbar tracts, they're going to terminate in cranial nerve nuclei. And they're going to provide more conscious control over your skeletal muscles. They move things like your jaw, your face, your eye, some muscles in your neck, and some muscles in your pharynx. Okay. You have corticospinal tracts, and their synapse is going to be on motor neurons in your anterior gray horns in your spinal cord. Okay, you may remember briefly in terms of the structure of the spinal cord, you have anterior gray horns. So the gray matter's in the middle of the spinal cord, anteriors toward the front, or if you're looking at kind of how they are in the book, toward the bottom. All right, so these are going to be visible along the medulla as a pair of thick veins. And the more inner level, or medulla is more inside, all right, called pyramids. So most of the axons are going to decussate or cross over to enter your descending lateral corticospinal tracts. Those that don't cross over will go into the anterior corticospinal tracts. So your pyramidal system is going to provide rapid and direct means for controlling your skeletal muscles. And activity in your pyramidal cells is a specific part of your primary motor cortex. It helps you contract your peripheral muscles. Now, just like there, we had a homunculus on the sensory side, we have one on the motor side. And it's a map and diagram specific muscles that get stimulated by your areas of your primary motor cortex. We'll show you what those look like in just a moment. All right, medical condition related to the motor pathways or cerebral palsy. And it's a combination of different disorders that affect your voluntary motor performance. Okay. And sometimes you'll see this associated, in terms of the face and kind of not being able to move parts of your body or parts of the face. All right, extrapyramidal system, or EPS. Let's see. Actually, before we cover that, let's look at an image or a few images. All right. So on your spinal cord, you have, again, your corticospinal pathway, lateral and anterior in purple, And we have lateral pathway or cerebral spinal path. We got our medial. So here's your medial. All right, sorry, there, the medial and lateral reticulospinal tracts, pectospinal tract, vestibulospinal tract. All right, so here, and this is a homunculus. And so this is the map. It tells you what parts of your body are controlled by various portions of your primary motor cortex, okay? So legs here, chest, arm, hands, face, trachea, okay? The signals are being sent down corticospinal tracts, down to the spinal cord, going to the anterior corticospinal tract, and going to your skeletal muscles, okay? But yeah, but this is a motor homunculus, and I'll show you so here's a sensory homunculus, okay? All right. Shows you what part of the body is controlled, different areas of the cortex, okay? Okay, extrapyramidal system. It's going to consist of multiple centers in your cerebrum, your diencephalon, and your brainstem that issue motor commands as a result of some subconscious processing. And they can change or direct contractions of your skeletal muscle either through inhibiting the lower motor neurons, facilitating the lower motor neurons, or stimulating. Okay. Outputs are going to descend via one of those pathways: vestibulospinal, tectospinal, rubrospinal, reticulospinal. Okay. Your vestibulospinal, and I think we showed you those just a few minutes ago, carry information about posture and balance. All right. Commands carried by these tectospinal tracts will change position in your arms, your neck, your head, and your eyes. Response to things like loud noises, sudden movements, and bright lights. Okay. Your rubrospinal tracts are going to carry motor responses to spinal motor neurons. Your motor commands are going to be carried by your reticulospinal tracts, and they're going to vary according to which region gets stimulated. All right, so then let's move on to the cerebral nuclei. And in the extrapyramidal system, these are considered to be the most complex and most important parts. So they're going to provide what we call background patterns of movement. They're involved in moving your voluntary muscles performing their activities. And here we're adjusting activities in your upper motor neurons and your extrapyramidal and pyramidal systems. So the cerebellum is going to monitor your proprioceptive sensations. You have visual information and vestibular sensations as movements that are underway, and they're going to regulate activity along your pyramidal and extrapyramidal motor pathways. And patterns in your cerebellar activity are learned. Okay, trial and error. The ability to fine-tune complex pattern movement is going to improve as you practice. All right, so you have your amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or Lou Gehrig's disease. It's progressive and degenerative. It affects motor neurons in your spinal cord, your brainstem, and your cerebral hemispheres. Okay. So people who get this have motor issues, right? Okay, we have different levels of processing and motor control. So the spinal reflexes and the cranial reflexes are going to provide fast and automatic responses that are actually pre-programmed. You have voluntary responses that are going to be more complex. They're going to take a lot more time to prepare them and to execute. Right, and that should make sense. Reflexes are supposed to be fast, right? So the integrative or integrative activities that are performed by your neurons in your cerebellar cortex and your cerebellar nuclei are essential for controlling your movements in a precise way. Okay, give you your coordination. All right, let's talk a little more about this in the context of development. So your spinal and cranial reflexes are your first reflexes to develop. The more complex reflexes develop once your neurons and your central nervous system start multiplying, enlarging, and connecting with one another. And then you get several anatomical factors that are contributing and making your central nervous system more mature and refining your various motor skills. Okay. All right, so anencephaly. So here, this is a rare condition. The brain's going to fail to develop above your mesencephalon over your lower diencephalons. All right, so death will usually occur in a period of days to months. All right, so let's take a pause here and talk about what we learn with motor pathways. Okay, again, not expecting you to know everything today, but just talk about what you're learning. Okay, let's talk a little bit about monitoring what happens in your brain. And if you guys ever heard of an EEG or an electroencephalogram, you should get a printout of electrical activity in your brain. Over time, you can check for different clinical conditions that way. Okay, related to that, looking for different brain waves, alpha waves. All right, you'll see those in adults that are healthy and awake. They're resting and have their eyes closed. But during sleep, these disappear. You also have beta waves, and these replace alpha waves when you're paying attention to stimuli or doing certain tasks. Okay, and they're present when you're concentrating or under stress or some psychological tension. Okay, you also have theta waves. You'll see these in children and adults when they're very frustrated. Okay. Delta waves, this is what you see during sleep. Okay. So delta is when you're asleep, alpha is when you're awake and resting, beta is when you're awake and focused, theta is when you're a kid or when you're really upset. Okay. Or really frustrated. All right, another condition related to this is a seizure. It's temporary disorder of the cerebrum. It's accompanied with abdominal movements, right? It could be shaking, unusual sensations, inappropriate behaviors, combination of these. Typically, you'll see, if someone is having an EEG done while they're having a seizure, you'll see, different patterns in the waves. All right, let's talk about what we call higher order functions. And these are functions that are performed by your cerebral cortex. They're going to involve complex interactions among different areas in your cerebral cortex, as well as between the cortex and other parts of your brain. These are going to involve conscious and unconscious processing of information. And these are subject to modification and adjustment over time. Okay, memory. So fact memories are specific bits of information. All right, so like things you got to remember for our exams and your practicals. We also have skill memories, and these are motor behaviors that you learn over time, like how to drive, right? Memories could be classified as short-term or long-term. Called short-term memories, primary memories. They're short-lived, but when you have them, you can recall them immediately. So it's like you're cramming an exam, so you remember it really well that day, and then you forget it after that. Long-term memories are going to last much longer. Okay, so hopefully as you continue to read your notes and read your notes and read your notes, you start committing it to long-term memory. You can subdivide that into secondary memories and tertiary memories. The secondary memories will fade with time, can be difficult to recall. Tertiary memories, okay, seem to be part of your consciousness. Like, even if you're, struggling, usually you're going to know what your name is. Like, you may not remember, all the cranial nerves, but you'll remember your name, right? So, or your phone number, or things like that. So you can kind of divide those up. Regions of your brain that are involved in consolidating and your memories and accessing the consolidated memory has to do with converting short-term memory to long-term memory. Your amygdaloid body and your hippocampus are going to be essential to memory consolidation. All right, related to that is the nucleus basalis. And it's a nucleus in your cerebrum. It's near your diencephalon. We're not really sure exactly what role it plays in memory storage and retrieval, but we think it has some role. All right, most long-term memories can be stored in your cerebral cortex. All right, so how memories get accessed and assembled is still kind of a mystery. All right, cellular mechanisms of memory formation and storage. So consolidations of memories at your cellular level involves anatomical changes and physiological changes in the neurons and the synapses. So cellular mechanisms that are involved in your memory formation and storage include things like increased neurotransmitter release, facilitation at synapses, which involves releasing small amounts of neurotransmitter continuously. That provides facilitation. and formation of more synaptic connections. Okay, so as you're learning, you're growing, you're studying, you're doing all things, you're actually involved in increasing neurotransmitter release. You're facilitating synapses. You're actually forming new synaptic connections to help you remember stuff. All right, the memory engram. It's a single circuit. It corresponds to a single memory. Okay. All right, conversion of your short-term memory into your memory engram takes time, about an hour or more. So whether that conversion will occur is going to depend on nature, it's on intensity, frequency of the original stimulus. All right, so, you're remembering something, if you have some intensity to it, you're probably going to remember. If you're in the military and they tell you to remember something and you forget and they make you do push-ups, you're probably going to start remembering after that. A little intensity there. If you're studying something and you study it once, you might not remember it, but if you study the same thing every day, you're probably going to remember. You have more frequency of your stimulus. All right, your nature. You might find that you study better in the library. You might find that you study at home in your room, you fall asleep. Okay. So it's nature of how you're trying to do the memory. Okay. Things that can stimulate your central nervous system, like nicotine, caffeine. Sometimes they can enhance your memory consolidation. They can sometimes facilitate neurotransmitter release and facilitation at synapses. All right. Amnesia, okay, you may have heard of this. All right, the medical condition involves losing memory after some trauma or disease. Okay. Consciousness. So here you have some conscious individual. That means that they're alert and they're attentive. And it's not really just conscious or unconscious. There's kind of shades, in between. There's different grades of consciousness and unconsciousness. The level of wakefulness indicates the level of what's the activity that's going on in your central nervous system. So when you're asleep, you're unconscious, but you can still be awakened by some normal sensory stimuli. Okay. You can either be in deep sleep or REM or REM sleep. So deep sleep is considered slow wave, body's relaxing, low cerebral cortex activity. In REM sleep or rapid eye movement sleep, you have active dreaming going on. Okay, so it's when you're having your dreams. So your periods of your REM and deep sleep will alternate throughout the night. So some periods you're in REM, some periods you're in deep sleep. So sleep is going to result in minor alterations in your physiological activities in your other systems, your organs. So if you're sleeping and feeling, if you're in deep sleep or rapid eye movement sleep, you may have certain things that happen to your body in those different times. So it's not just making, allowing you to get rest, sleep also benefits your central nervous system. Okay. And consciousness is going to be determined by interactions between your brainstem and your cerebral cortex. All right. We also have the reticular activating system. So here it's one of the most important components of your brainstem. It is a network in your reticular formation. All right, so it has reticular in the name. And when it's inactive, your cerebral cortex is inactive. When the reticular activating system gets stimulated, it activates your cerebral cortex. The mesencephalic portion of your reticular activating system is the actual center of your reticular activating system. Okay, so when you have more stimulation of that mesencephalic region, you're going to be more attent and more alert. So any stimulus that can activate your reticular activating system is going to end your sleep, like your alarm clock. So the effects of your reticular activating system are not long lasting, less than a minute. Your consciousness is going to be maintained through positive feedback, and that continues to keep your reticular activating system stimulated. And after several hours of activity, your reticular activating system actually becomes less responsive to that stimulation. So it's positive feedback, but eventually it's going to desensitize. Okay, brain chemistry. So here you have different neurotransmitters. We have about 50 that are known. Ones that are more common and widespread or more important: acetylcholine, norepinephrine, gamma aminobutyric acid or GABA, serotonin, dopamine, substance P, histamine, enkephalins, and endorphins. All right, so many of our neurotransmitters work in balance with each other, and so if you change that balance, you're going to change the function of your brain. So in many instances, how a specific neurotransmitter functions has been discovered by researching how drugs affect your brain. All right. So personality. So your personality, self-awareness, these are still not completely understood, but they feel like they are characteristic of your brain being integrated, lots of different parts working together rather than just one piece controlling your personality. Okay. So how does aging affect your nervous system? Well, as you age, your brain size and weight gets smaller. Your neurons decrease in number. You get decreased blood flow to your brain. And you get changes in how these synapses are organized in your brain as you get older. You also have intracellular and extracellular changes in the central nervous system neurons. Related to that is Alzheimer's disease. So here it's a progressive disorder, which means it gets usually progressively worse, characterized by losing your higher cerebral functions, the ones that we talked about a little while ago. All right. And it's most common cause of senile dementia or senility. Okay. So a lot of dementia is related to Alzheimer's disease. So that is sensory pathways in the somatic nervous system. So I'll give you all a minute to kind of discuss what you learned in this section, particularly with reticular activating system, higher order functions. Okay. All right. And you can do this at home as well. All right, so let's finish up by talking about your exam 4. And let's see, we'll actually do this. I'll pause and we'll do this in another video. So.